We tracked more than 20 Russian combat vehicles moving on Brovary as Moscow tried to force open an eastern approach into Kyiv. Picture the scene. A heavy Russian armored column rolls down the M01 highway, tanks and armored personnel carriers pressing toward the capital's outer defenses. To the crews inside those holes, the road ahead looks like an open corridor. From above, and from concealed positions in the villages lining that highway, it was already a mapped kill zone. This was not some routine convoy crossing contested ground. It was the leading edge of Moscow's doctrine for taking Kyiv fast, armor punching straight down a highway before the defenders could organize. And that doctrine carried a price the column's own commanders never priced in. When heavy armor bunches up on one predictable road with nothing covering its flanks, every meter of that asphalt becomes a potential ambush site. One disabled vehicle stops the whole formation cold. A bottleneck turns concentrated firepower into a stationary target, and once Ukrainian eyes locked onto that column, whatever surprise it still had was already gone. It wasn't advancing into Kyiv anymore. It was rolling straight into a kill zone that had been waiting for it. Let's break down why this mattered, because Brovari was never just about stopping one Russian column outside one Kyiv suburb. It exposed something structural about how modern armored warfare actually works once one side owns the sky. So how did this highway become a trap in the opening weeks of the war for Kyiv? Russia was pushing on the capital from multiple directions at once in early March 2022. And one of the most direct eastern routes ran straight through Skybin and Brovari, along the M01. On the evening of March 9th, the 90th Guards Tank Division, specifically its 6th and 239th Tank Regiments, moved into the area. More than 20 combat vehicles, including T-72 tanks, armored personnel carriers, and at least one TOS-1A thermobaric rocket launcher riding in the column. This wasn't a probing patrol. It was a heavy mechanized push meant to pressure Kyiv from the east, while the rest of the Russian advance squeezed from the north and west. Here's the tactical reality worth sitting with. As that column rolled down the M01, its commanders were almost certainly betting that speed alone would carry them through. But the lead tanks and the logistics tail behind them, fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, command vehicles, were all forced to share the exact same stretch of road. Was that highway already targeted before anyone in those turrets realized what they'd driven into? That's the actual question worth asking here. Because in a fast-moving offensive, roads aren't just transit lines. They're the arteries the whole assault depends on. And the same road that lets you move fast is the same road that tells the enemy exactly where you're going to be. Heavy mechanized formations need room, dispersion, and time to react if something goes wrong. Once a column that size gets funneled into a narrow corridor, it becomes fully exposed to drones, forward scouts, and ordinary people watching from their windows. The decisive mistake here happened long before the first missile left its tube. It happened in how tightly that column packed itself onto one road with almost no spacing and no flank security. Proper dispersion is what keeps armor alive under fire. Collapse that spacing, and a single emergency stop ripples through the whole formation like a shockwave. Drivers lose room to maneuver, commanders lose time to react, and the vehicles at the back see nothing but smoke and gridlock ahead of them. Russian planners were clearly betting that raw tempo would get them through before Ukrainian defenses east of the city could set up properly. But near Brovari, speed couldn't outrun geography. If Ukrainian forces already had eyes on that route, moving fast didn't help the column escape. It just made the column easier to track. There's also a command problem baked into a formation this size. The lead vehicles are living a completely different battlefield reality than whatever is happening at the back of the line. When the front slows down, the middle compresses. When the rear hesitates, the whole column loses cohesion, and at that point it stops functioning as one unit and starts existing as a scattered collection of individual targets fighting for their own survival. That's why Brovari is still studied as a textbook case. Armor doesn't fail purely because the other side has bigger guns. It fails the moment it enters ground the defender has already mapped, registered, and pre-targeted. The real threat that night wasn't the anti-tank missile or the artillery shell. It was visibility. What do you think was the bigger mistake here? Packing the column that tightly, or underestimating how deep Ukrainian reconnaissance already reached? Drop your read in the comments. Ukraine wasn't relying on luck at Brovari. This stretch of ground was already being watched well before the Russian column ever reached it. Ukrainian forces around Skybin combined drones, forward observers, and reports from ordinary residents to build a picture of Russian movement toward the capital's eastern approaches, and the ambush itself was executed by elements of Ukraine's 72nd Mechanized Brigade. This wasn't a spontaneous roadside clash. It was one piece of a coordinated defensive effort built to detect incoming forces early, track their route, and have artillery pre-registered on the ground before contact was ever made. Picture how that layered defense actually worked in practice. Drones tracked the highway from overhead. Forward spotters watched vehicle movement from concealed positions nearby. Local residents fed back real-time confirmation as the column rolled through key points along the road. The real question worth asking is whether that column was effectively targeted before a single shot was fired, because that reframes the entire engagement. This wasn't a desperate, reactive defense thrown together at the last second. It was a prepared kill zone with multiple layers already in place and waiting. On a modern battlefield, the first line of defense isn't an anti-tank team, it's intelligence. Without eyes in the air and on the ground, even the best weapons in the world end up striking too early, too late, or not at all. A layered ambush works as a system, not a single action. The drone provides the overhead picture. Spotters confirm the column's direction and speed. Anti-tank teams hold their fire because a shot too early gives away the whole position. Artillery pre-targets the exact stretch of road where the column is expected to bunch up and stall. And infantry covers the flanks, watching side roads and tree lines for anyone trying to escape the kill zone. Every layer has a distinct job, but they're all working toward the same outcome: funnel the column into a spot where it has no good options left. Ukraine didn't need to destroy the whole formation in the opening seconds for this to work. Structured ambushes rarely succeed that way. The goal was to break momentum, create confusion, and force the column to stop or pull back under fire. Once momentum breaks, the whole formation becomes far more vulnerable. Deliberate movement turns into hesitation. Crews freeze, waiting on orders. Drivers can't find room to maneuver. The column's structure falls apart, and that's exactly when high-value targets start presenting themselves to the defenders. This is where patience becomes as valuable as any weapon on the field. If Ukrainian units already had the column under observation, the deciding factor wasn't spotting the enemy. It was having the discipline to wait for the right moment. Fire too soon, and the column scatters before it's fully committed. Wait too long, and the window closes. That balance depends entirely on real-time observation, because a drone overhead isn't just tracking positions, it's watching for the exact instant the column is sitting in the worst possible spot. So let's walk through how the trap actually closed. A drone almost certainly held wide area surveillance on the whole column, while anti-tank teams locked onto the lead and trailing vehicles specifically. Artillery stood ready to fire the moment the column slowed down. Infantry secured the flanks, not to fight tanks head-on, but to cut off any escape route for crews trying to bail out. None of this runs on a rigid script, but it reflects the underlying logic of how the whole engagement was built. A well-run ambush never opens with the first explosion. It opens while the target still believes the road ahead is completely clear. That highway turned from an open route into a sealed trap in a matter of minutes. Drone footage released afterward by Ukraine's Defense Intelligence Agency showed the column taking heavy, accurate fire as the formation broke apart and scrambled into a chaotic retreat. According to a Ukrainian soldier who took part in the operation, the ambush deliberately targeted the first and last vehicles in the column first, specifically to trap everything in between. That detail matters, because the goal was never just killing one tank. It was locking down the entire convoy at once. Think about what that does inside the column psychologically. The lead vehicle isn't just the first machine in line. It sets the pace. It confirms the road is clear. It tells everyone behind it that the way forward is safe. Take that vehicle out, and you don't just lose one tank, you lose command and control for the whole formation. The vehicles behind it suddenly face a road blocked by smoke, wreckage, and fire, while striking the rear vehicle seals off any chance of retreat. Rear security exists to protect the exit. Hit that, and everyone caught in the middle loses their only way out. That's the exact moment a mechanized column feels trapped, blocked ahead, cut off behind, and stuck in the middle with armor that can't turn around on a narrow road and can't hide from a drone watching from above. That's why hitting the front and rear specifically mattered more than just shooting at whatever target came up first. A column isn't a random collection of tanks, it's a moving system, and every vehicle in it depends on the spacing and reaction time of the vehicles around it. Stop the front and hit the rear, and the whole thing compresses. Drivers freeze. Commanders need time just to figure out what's happening, and different crews are getting completely different, often contradictory information about what's going on up and down the line. Watch how fast that chaos compounds. One crew pushes around a burning disabled vehicle. Another stops dead to avoid the kill zone. A third tries to reverse, blind to whatever's behind them. From overhead, that all reads as one predictable pattern: an armored advance falling apart in real time inside a corridor it can't escape. This is exactly where aerial reconnaissance turns a traffic jam into a catastrophe. On an ordinary road, a stall is an inconvenience. On a drone-watched battlefield, it's a fixed target waiting to be worked through methodically. Artillery getting exact coordinates, anti-tank teams waiting for clean shots, commanders reading at a glance which vehicles still have mobility. This wasn't the annihilation of the entire Russian formation, and exact losses from that engagement are still debated. Independent verification later confirmed several destroyed or disabled T-72 tanks and additional damaged vehicles, along with one tank captured intact. But the real story at Brovari was never about a precise body count. It was the total loss of momentum. A fast-moving offensive force got stripped of the one thing that made it dangerous: its speed. That's the core vulnerability of modern armor under constant observation. Tanks are most effective when they can maneuver freely, use terrain, support infantry, and keep pressure on the enemy. Trap that same armor in a bottleneck with no clear read on what's ahead or behind, and its combat effectiveness collapses fast. The firepower is still there. The steel is still there. What disappears is the confidence to actually use either one. If you were commanding that column in that exact moment, would you push forward, reverse, or abandon the road entirely? Every option looks reasonable, and every option risks driving straight into a second ambush. Once the Russian advance lost its tempo, Ukrainian artillery immediately capitalized on the confusion, and that's the real strategic lesson buried under all that smoke. Artillery wasn't just there to destroy armor, it was there to break the ability to think clearly under fire. The immediate effect is physical: shrapnel through tires, tracks thrown, hulls compromised, crews taking casualties. But the psychological effect runs just as deep. Smoke and dust cut visibility. Drivers lose sight of the vehicle ahead. Gunners can't get a clean read on incoming fire. And commanders are processing multiple threats at once, while the whole column grinds to a halt. Every crew is experiencing this differently too. Explosions ahead for some, impacts behind for others, broken radio traffic or total silence for the rest. Under that kind of pressure, a unit stops behaving like one force and splinters into individual crews making life-or-death calls with almost no reliable information. Terrain sealed the outcome here just as much as firepower did. The road through Skybin and Brovary wasn't just a line on a map. It ran through farmland, village edges, tight bends, tree lines, and soft early spring ground. Staying on the hard asphalt meant staying locked inside a kill zone Ukrainian observers had already mapped. Leaving the road meant risking getting bogged down in mud, throwing a track, or driving straight into another observed area. Under fire, cutting across an open field probably felt like the obvious move to a crew inside a T-72. But with the spring thaw already softening the ground, that open field was its own trap. Wet earth bogs down heavy armor and forces powerful engines to dig themselves in rather than move. A tank that stalls out there stops being an offensive weapon and becomes a fixed target inside a zone that's already being watched, still armored, still armed, but with the mobility gone that made either of those things matter. That's why Brovary wasn't simply a clash between two sets of equipment. It was a case study in fire and maneuver working together. The highway let Russian forces move fast, but it also funneled them into a narrow, predictable corridor. The open fields looked like an escape route, but they swallowed heavy armor whole. The villages along the route cut down sightlines even further. None of that terrain looked remarkable on a map beforehand, but Ukrainian defenders had already folded every inch of it into how they planned the engagement. Moscow was counting on sheer mass to push through the defenders east of the city. Instead, that same mass took away the column's ability to disperse or pull back once it came under fire. Light infantry can scatter and adapt quickly. Heavy armor needs room, coordination, and time, and Kiev's defenders systematically denied it all three. Brovary didn't single-handedly decide the fight for Kiev, but it showed clearly why the Russian push toward the capital lost momentum. By the end of March 2022, Russian officials confirmed they were scaling back operations around Kiev and Chernihiv, and within days, Russian forces began a full withdrawal from northern Ukraine entirely. That retreat came after weeks of exactly this kind of attrition, stretched supply lines, stalled advances, and a defense around the capital that kept finding ways to punish exposed columns like this one. Brovary was one engagement, but it exposed a structural flaw running through the entire Russian approach. It wasn't a shortage of tanks or artillery on paper. Russia had plenty of both, along with the raw capacity to push serious combat power down major highways. What broke down was how those assets were actually managed once things went wrong under pressure. Modern warfare keeps proving that raw armor and mass aren't enough if the other side sees you coming first, moves that intelligence fast, and hits your column exactly where it's weakest. That's why Brovary keeps getting studied years later. It wasn't just an ambush caught on camera. It was proof that a smaller, more agile force, with better terrain knowledge and faster reaction times, can neutralize a much heavier mechanized formation. None of this means the tank is obsolete. It means heavy armor becomes extremely vulnerable the moment it's packed together, locked onto a predictable route, and exposed to drone-directed artillery. The pattern is consistent. Early warning buys defenders time they can't get back. Guided anti-tank weapons take out the highest value targets first. Artillery grinds down what's left of the stalled